Today, I'm thrilled to welcome Dr. Chris Willard, a clinical psychologist, one of the world's leading experts in mindfulness and self-compassion. He's a Harvard Medical School faculty member, author of 20 plus books for adults and children, and internationally sought after speaker, having presented in over 30 countries and at 2 TED events. His work integrates neuroscience, mindfulness, and trauma-informed approaches to help individuals and families flourish. Chris, what a pleasure it is to have you here today. And I
Oh,
just
it's
wanted
so
to
great to be
start.
here.
Lovely. I just wanted to start. Can you share a bit about your personal journey for the listeners today and how mindfulness found its way into your life and what led you into this work?
Absolutely. I mean, I often talk about kind of what was my early experience of mindfulness, and growing up in the 80s, that was not, particularly common word, but I had these experiences that I look back on that were something like mindfulness. And I think it's important to start there because for a lot of us that feel like I have to go to a mountaintop or spend hours a day doing this or something like that, or how do I get my kids to stand still or sit still? Like that feels like a tall order. But I remember things just like being with my dad and like looking up at clouds in the sky while we're floating on this pond. And he's like, if you just breathe with the cloud, you can like eventually make it disappear just with your breath and your mind. Or being at this very sweet nature camp, and walking in the woods, and the counselor is saying we're just gonna kind of walk as silently as we can without making a sound. And then realizing years later, when I did like an MBSR course, mindfulness based stress reduction course, and we did mindful walking, oh, it's a lot like that, kind of walking quietly in the woods without making a sound. You're not thinking about the past or the future. You're just thinking about each footstep, the movement of each muscle, the texture of the ground underneath you. Or being at that same camp, and they said, we're going to listen to all the sounds we can hear in the silence, and thinking we're not going to hear anything. It's totally silent. And then sure enough, you can hear the wind whispering in the trees and hear the brook babbling away in the distance, and these kind of little moments that were really like a mindful listening practice. And so when I started getting interested in mindfulness as an adult, right, I really thought back, reconnected to, in a sense, these seeds that were planted, and realized that was really mindfulness or something close to it. This isn't have to be this whole weird thing. And it really came back at this really important point in my life. I had gone off to college or university, I suppose you'd say, and had a really hard time with depression, with anxiety, with substance abuse, and ended up taking a lot of time off. And in that time, first year, just sort of floundering around. Second year, my parents ended up basically dragging me on a mindfulness retreat with Thich Nhat Hanh, who some people might know as a mindfulness teacher, wonderful Vietnamese monk. And on that retreat, it was like so transformative. I mean, I was 22, I was open-minded, I was desperate, all of that, but it was like everything made sense, everything felt connected. I felt happier, I felt more creative, I felt more focused. Like anxiety slipped away. I've now been sober for a couple decades. Like all of these things started to transform, and I was just so excited about, can I bring mindfulness into, helping young people? And I worked as a teacher a few years, and then became a clinical psychologist, and still trying, like, how do I teach this to kids? How do I teach it to parents, to teachers, therapists? How can we help people bring more of this into their lives? Because I've seen how helpful it was for me, but also just really in the past couple of decades, seeing it transform families, kids, people struggling with all kinds of things, learning issues, substance abuse issues, mental health issues, or just like managing the stress of everyday life with a little bit more grace and a little bit less internal chaos, despite the outside chaos not always slowing down. So that's sort of the Cliff Notes version of my journey, I suppose. Yeah.
Yeah, that's an incredible journey. And I love how the roots of it actually started in your childhood when you look back as your dad talking to you about the clouds and taking in a breath and actually kind of teaching you those roots. Because I think that's really important, isn't it? Sometimes if we can get those roots into our children, they might not
Mm-hmm.
always realize it here today, but it will play a part in their life at some point. And as you say, it's kind of all fallen into place over your journey.
Yeah.
So can you, you've written extensively on teaching mindfulness to children and families. What's the most surprising thing that you've learned from the work so far?
I mean, in some ways, this should be more obvious, but I feel like for so long, I feel like I was kind of grinding my gears, trying to like yell at kids to breathe or something like that, which is obviously not going to work, and really kind of stepping back to if we want more mindful, compassionate kids, what we need to do is like surround them with more mindful and compassionate adults, so that
Hmm.
is teaching it together when we can, right? It's like, when I work with a school, it's like, I'd like to like do a talk for the parents and also read some books and do some exercises with the kids. And I also want to work with the staff in the school so that everyone kind of gets this, and it's in the milieu in some way. It's in the air that we breathe, so to speak, and not just like that kid's acting up, make them focus on their
Hmm.
breath, which is totally going to backfire, obviously. So that to me has been really just like inspiring and fun. And it's the most fun way to teach, when you're then kind of getting everybody sort of speaking the same language on the same page, in these different ways. And then also kind of discovering that, and I think probably because I, took some, mindfulness classes and retreats where it was like we do moving mindfully and breathing mindfully and eating mindfully, that especially with kids who are probably going to be a little bit squirmy and wiggly, that's okay. It's helping them bring more awareness to that, to find playful ways to help them find stillness when stillness matters. Or if they're moving around, how can they be more aware of moving around, mindful walking, like you're walking as silently as possible? Or
Hmm.
imagine you're walking over thin ice, or practice walking on bubble wrap or something like that, and not breaking the bubbles, or noticing all the shades of green as you walk past them in the forest. Like that, these are ways to not just say, do some mindful walking, and the kids are, I feel like a zombie, this is boring, right? But it's like, oh, we'll walk
Yeah.
like a ninja, right? That makes it more compelling and interesting. Or like one of my favorite studies, Lev Vygotsky is this child development researcher from, I don't know, 80 years ago or something, but he did this study where he was trying to get, I think it was 7 or 8 year olds to stand still, which, this went about as well as you expected, right? The kids are running around after a couple of minutes. And he calls them back in and he says, I want you to stand still for as long as you can, but this time I want you to imagine that you're like a knight guarding a castle.
Hmm.
And of course, as soon as he puts it in this playful way, almost competitive way, the kids are able to stand still for like 15 minutes.
Wow.
And, is it mindfulness exactly? Well, not exactly, but it's creating stillness. It's quieting the nervous system down. It's kind of creating the conditions where then maybe they can start to get more playful with their mindfulness and find some stillness. And so
Hmm.
it's, that's sort of the principle behind it for me, is how do we make, for adults, we're trying to focus on our breath or something like that. And kids are always, my own son is always telling me like, Dad, breathing is boring. I don't, I never
Yeah.
want to breathe again. And, he's still breathing. I checked. But the idea being, it's like, play can be that anchor of attention, right? It
Hmm.
doesn't just have to be some totally still thing or some, boring thing like the breath. And we can also find ways to make the breath more interesting. But I think that's been really fun, is like meeting kids where they are, and how they learn is through play. And so how do we bring then play in kind of formal and informal ways to teach some of this stuff? Yeah.
I love that. I love that. I think I've done the traditional things, like you say, of trying to teach my kids more about breath work. And it
Mm-hmm.
started the first couple of times because it was something new and something interesting. And now they are so uninterested. So I think, just as you say, to be able to meet them where they are and find a
Yeah.
playful way to make them more aware of what they're doing. Like, as you say, we can walk like a ninja and be really quiet and do something like that is
Mm-hmm.
definitely much more engaging. And I think, I've got two very active boys, and that's, I think, the only way I'm going to stand a chance of teaching them some more mindfulness skills. So I'm definitely going to have a go at
Some
that.
ninja skills, maybe a little more fun.
Yeah.
Right,
Yeah. They'll
right,
be
right.
interested
Or
in
seeing
that for sure.
athletes do this stuff, like the Olympics last year, like seeing so many athletes talk about mindfulness as helping them,
Hmm.
kind of, get focused on the moment, manage their stress, all those kinds of things, I think has also, been really inspiring, especially for those kind of skeptical boys who get, the breathing gets a little boring.
Yeah,
So
definitely.
yeah.
So, what
Yeah.
role then would you say self compassion plays in resilience, especially during those tough moments or trauma, even?
Yeah, I mean, self compassion, which is also, something I feel like I've been practicing mindfulness for, I don't know, 25 years or so, maybe about 10 or 12 years in, kind of discovering more of the mindful self compassion work, Chris Germer, Kristen Neff. And it was like, I mean, pouring gasoline on it is not exactly the metaphor, but it was like this accelerant for sort of like a little bit more inner peace, managing that kind of inner critic that I think so many of us have, especially if
Hmm.
we've had a hard time or we've been through a traumatic experience or multiple ones of those, or we're struggling with work or relationships, right? That critical voice just kicks up. and being able to take the time to not just only see what my experience is, which mindfulness helps us do, but to actually offer myself a little bit of what I need, to give myself just some kindness because I deserve it, right?
Mhm.
And that I just am as deserving as everybody else. And as a caregiver, right? As a psychologist, I'm a caregiver. As a parent, I'm a caregiver, right? As a son of aging parent, I'm a caregiver, right? But finding that opportunity, like, okay, what if I were able to be as patient with myself, as
Mhm.
kind to myself as I would to a friend who, maybe lost their patience with their child, a friend on the, on the playground, or, what if I were able to be as kind and forgiving toward myself as, I might towards someone else who made whatever simple mistake, I make, or whatever dozens of simple mistakes I make on a daily
Yeah.
basis. And it's been so helpful to let go of a lot of the shame that I've felt over the course of my life, to to forgive myself for various mistakes that I've made, and also I think to help me through some of those traumatic experiences, or those times I felt like I wasn't good enough, or regrets that I've had about difficult times in my life, and it's been so helpful and so healing. And
Mhm.
I think too, as a caregiver, like, it really is, what how we are really trickles out and models for the kids. Like, if I am able to, my son was diagnosed with ADD a couple of years ago, and basically, looking at all the symptoms, my wife was like, oh, you have all these symptoms too, right? But like, being able to talk in a kind voice to myself and help my son to do that. And then I'll do something like, oh my gosh, I can't believe it. I like double booked this appointment, which I still do every
Mhm.
week. And my son will just come up and be like, that's okay, Dad. Like, let yourself off the hook. You've got some ADD. It's all right. You'll do better next time. And it's like, he practices saying that to me. I practice saying that to myself. He practices saying that to himself. Like, it can become this really beautiful thing where we end up not with those, with the critical voice we all have. It's often not so caring caregivers, whether it
Mhm.
was parents who shamed us, or teachers who told us that we were, this or that, or other, bullies and people in our lives. And being able to let go of that voice and just be kinder to ourselves, and to help our kids grow up with that is such a great gift that I hope I'm able to pass on to both of my kids too. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean it's tough, isn't it? It's so much easier to be compassionate to other people and be forgiving of their mistakes. And if anyone comes to you with anything, I use my husband as an example all the time, that he would come and say, I've had a really rough time with the kids and I didn't do the best. I shouted, I did this and
Mm-hmm.
whatever. And I'd be the first to say to him, like, cut yourself some slack. You've got a lot going on. There's work, your mind's elsewhere. Like, the kids, they're okay. It is
Mm-hmm.
hard. But when it comes to talking about that sort of thing myself, I feel I'm a lot harder on myself. I expect more.
Yeah.
I give myself a harder pep talk. It's harder to offer the same level of self-compassion, isn't it, as you would to a relative or a friend. But you're so
Right.
right. I think the key there is, if we want to be able to teach that to our children and pass it on to the next generation, then we really do need to learn to model that behavior. So, as in the beautiful
Mm-hmm.
example you gave there, that your son kind of modeled it to you and let you off the hook for some of your ADD behavior, and then you're kind of able to say it back to him, and you can pass that kind of beautiful cycle between the two of you, and I love that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So, and even I remember reading some study about teachers. Like, if teachers like deliberately make a mistake, like spell something wrong on the blackboard, or whiteboard, I guess these days, and like, oh, whoops, and the kid's like, oh, you spelled that wrong, Dr. Willard or whoever, and then the teacher's like, oh, whoops, I made a mistake, no big deal. Like, actually, the students in that class, when a teacher models that healthy self-talk that's not so critical, those students actually take more risks, are more likely
Mm-hmm.
to put their hand up when they don't know the answer, because being wrong isn't so scary. Making a mistake is not so scary. And so it's not like I'm out there trying to make mistakes in front of my kids, but hearing that is such a relief, and such a like, oh, like, I still can hold myself to high standards, but it's how I manage it when I, fall short, or don't quite, stick the landing on whatever it is that I'm doing. And it's like, what a relief for me, what a relief for my kid. They
Mm.
see me as human, or the people I'm working with. I it's actually very, like, this is actually a true story from like 2 hours ago. I went to my therapist, right? And and I got there early, and she came outside, and I scared her because I was sitting on her steps, and she was like, and I was like, oh my gosh, I was like, oh, it's okay, you're it's like I see that you're human. Sorry, I scared you. And then she locked herself out, like because she was so flustered. She just like reached out to get the mail, but then sort of chatted. But it was like, I'm like relieved that my therapist locked herself out and then had to go in the window. And it's like, I don't know if she's like totally mortified right now, but it is like, oh, I see her as human also. And she's still a great therapist. Like she's both someone that locked herself out, embarrassed herself in front of me, and is a tremendous therapist who's been so helpful to me. It's like, yeah. So,
Yeah, you're so right. You're
yeah.
so right. I'll give you a funny story from my week. Actually, I'm dyslexic, and as is my
Uh-huh.
eldest son. It's not uncommon for me throughout my life to continuously like switch letters, which we know is like a dyslexic thing. So
Right.
I thought I was
Right.
being really nice getting end of term presents for the teachers at school, particularly my son's football coach, who he loves. So I had these beautiful
Mm-hmm.
cupcakes made with footballs and everything, and thought I had written best coach on them. And I
Uh-huh.
was showing them to my husband, and he was like, you do realize they say Bet's coach, not best. I was like, oh. I was like, this is an hour before I give them to him. So I turned to my son Harry and I was like, do you know what? I was like, this just gives us a great story because he is still the best coach and he's going to
Yeah.
laugh. And he did. He thought it was brilliant. And he was like, I am going to Instagram that. So I was like, it's okay. It's okay. Mummy does stuff
Yeah.
like this. It's okay. You're going to learn this
Right.
happens to you too.
Right.
Like, you
Right.
got to be able to
Right.
laugh about it.
Exactly. Exactly. And laugh with ourselves, as much as at ourselves too, in that
Yeah,
way. It's so important.
definitely.
Yeah.
So, following on from that, what obviously self-talk and internal compassion or lack of it shapes
Hmm.
how does it shape then how our kids do respond to tough emotions?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot about, both my own kids and watching my son shift toward healthier self-talk at a younger age, from being quite perfectionist or sort of wondering why he's always losing things. And not like, oh, the excuse is I have ADD. Oh, I don't have, I have ADD. I don't have to pay attention. I don't have to remember things, but just like, oh, it's hard for me to remember things because I have ADD. And here's how I can develop a system, not like I'm just a piece of whatever,
Yeah,
that can
yeah,
never
yeah.
change, which is actually, I think there's a lot of overlap. I've actually wanted to write more about this in terms of like self-compassion versus self-esteem and growth mindset versus fixed mindset. Like a lot of us
Hmm.
who work with kids and think about kids, think about that growth mindset of like, oh, I can change versus fixed mindset is here's how I am. I can never change. I can never learn. And when we teach kids growth mindset, that sort of like, you can't do it or you can't do it yet, right? You can't make the soccer team, you can't make the soccer team yet, right? You can't learn Spanish, you can't learn Spanish yet, right? That's shifting into growth mindset. And that really, to me, I'd love to see more research on this, but like goes hand in hand with self-compassion, which is about, kind of a more expansive view of ourselves, that we are bigger than our mistakes or bigger than our diagnoses or bigger than our learning differences or bigger than our different foibles. And I think that that's really tremendous because it also, the other thing that self-compassion does is it helps take some of that stigma out, too, at the
Hmm.
same time. It's like, yeah, it feels lousy sometimes to have ADD or to have anxiety or depression or struggle with addiction or whatever it might be that we all struggle with just being a parent, right? But to be able to then take the shame and stigma off of that, and then it's like, okay, I'm depressed, I can manage that, but I'm depressed and I feel bad about being depressed. Like, that's not going to be helpful. And again, it's easier said than done, but that to me is where self compassion comes in and can kind of melt away a little bit of that first layer of shame and stigma
Hmm.
around the, whatever the struggle is that we have in our lives. And we can deal just much more directly with, now I can deal with the depression, not just the shame around the depression. Now I can deal with the anxiety, not just the shame around the anxiety. Now I can deal with the anger issues that I have, not the shame I have around the anger issues about occasionally losing it with my kid, whatever it might be. And that's so helpful. And it's so helpful for young people too, to start to be able to have some of that stigma not there from a younger age. They can just
Hmm.
deal with it as it is, and not all the societal BS that they have to deal with around, you should be embarrassed that you have anxiety, you should be ashamed that you're depressed, or you should be, like you should hide the fact that you have attention issues or whatever it might be. And that's really beautiful. Like My son's upstairs. I hope he's not upset I'm sharing all this stuff. He's mostly okay with me sharing. But I mean, like, and this actually is something that I think he would be fine with, because I had a friend come over a couple of weeks ago, and she was sort of like, kind of offhandedly was like, "Oh, and I had a panic attack." And my son just like, my son's actually great. I feel like I'm making him sound totally pathological here, but he was just like, "Oh, I have panic attacks," and it was just like, and my friend just sort of like did a double take, but it was just like, for him, what's actually amazing about this generation is it's just like, it's part of him. It's not all of him.
Hmm.
It's not something to be ashamed of. It's not something to get over identified with. If I have panic attacks, I
Hmm.
can't take tests. I have panic attacks. I can't try out for soccer. It's just like, oh, this is a thing I have, and here's how I deal with it. And like, what a beautiful thing that, hopefully that can continue, that lack of stigma, that lack of self-criticism around that. I should give examples about my own life or my daughter or other people besides just my son, but I'm feeling proud of him lately. But it's amazing to see. Or I think about when I was younger and struggling, right? How much
Hmm.
shame there was. And had I grown up with more explicit mindfulness, had I grown up with more explicit, here's what self-compassion is, and here's how to practice self-compassion,
Hmm.
that would then be have made my, journey from depression and anxiety, journey through ADD, journey through addiction, I think just, it still would have been hard, but there'd be a layer that wouldn't have been there in the same way.
Yeah.
And so my hope in sharing this with young people is, we can peel back that layer and just deal with things as they are. Yeah.
I guess like what you're saying there, from my understanding, is that's resilience, isn't it? And that's what we
Yeah.
want to be teaching them, is that we can't stop these things coming alive along in life, like anxiety and depression or tough times. We're going to have, I don't know, relatives that die or tough challenges. But I guess it's
Mm-hmm.
trying to teach our children the skills to cope with those big emotions and hopefully know how to handle it, or at least bounce back that much quicker when they do go through these experiences.
Right. See the impermanence of them, and I think that it's like, okay, this is a hard time, but it's not a hard, it doesn't have to be a hard life. But that resilience is like bouncing back. It's like,
Hmm.
that's how a friend of mine defines it. My friend Linda Graham. It's like your ability to bounce back from hard things, and it's like, and that's, not just bouncing back, but sometimes we bounce back even higher, even
Yeah.
stronger, the next time. But to me, that's what resilience is like being a little bit more stress proof, and then
Hmm.
also when difficult things happen, not just kind of crumpling and wilting in the face of them, like many stereotypes these days about young people, who I think just do also objectively, like, the world's a harder place than it was, for, in some ways, our generation.
It's more
So,
complicated.
they've got it pretty rough. But I think that is a negative stereotype. But I do feel like resilience is like, how do you show up and deal with hard things, and keep pushing yourself through them? Absolutely. Yeah.
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 So, what would you say mindful parents do differently then when responding to their children in emotional distress?
Yeah, I mean, you kind of put the word in it right there. It's in some ways responding, not reacting. It's
Hmm.
responding to what's happening in the moment. Someone asked me, I think on a podcast a couple of years ago, like, what does mindful parenting mean? And I was like, oh, I got to really think about this. But if we think about mindfulness as being in the moment, it's like, well, first of all, you can't be a parent from like a meditation cushion, like, so you have to be off the meditation cushion. But it's like, how do we respond to the moment? And one of the things that we often do as parents is we respond to a past moment or a past experience. So we respond with, like, the way our parents responded, that sort of
Hmm.
Freudian repetition compulsion, where we've all had that experience where, like, I cannot believe that my dad's words came out of my mouth, or my mom's, smirk came out of my mouth, or whatever it was,
Yeah.
that we're then putting on our kids. So we're not repeating, our own caregivers mistakes, or something like that, or even their, whatever. And we're also not like mindlessly rebelling from it, like, I was spoiled, I'm going to deny my kids. I was denied everything, I'm going to spoil my kids, right? My
Hmm.
parents were easygoing, I'm going to be strict, right? My parents were strict, I'm going to be easygoing. It's about, like, how do we make a choice in the moment? Is it useful to be a little stricter now, or is it useful to be a little bit looser now, right?
Hmm.
How do I respond and listen, not just react unconsciously by repeating or reacting or rebelling, right? But how do we actually respond, to what's really happening in the moment, and see it as it is, which then is also, to me, it's so hand in hand with the other best, kind of parenting techniques out there that are nothing fancy, but the sort of like, how to talk so kids will listen, listen so kids will talk. It's like, just validate. It's like, well, name what's happening right now.
Yeah.
You're upset and I'm upset right now. You sound like you're feeling really, sad in this moment. You sound like
Hmm.
you're feeling really scared about school right now. Is that true? Right. Trying to validate, get curious about what our kids' experience is before we jump to
Hmm.
conclusions, or we jump to a shut up and breathe, or something like that. It's not
Yeah.
going to help either. But that to me is sort of then what naturally starts to come out of it. Yeah.
Hmm. I found those books really useful, actually, the How to Talk to Little Children books. And one of
Oh,
the
so
things that
good.
I found
Yeah.
really helped me, actually, was she really acknowledges in the end of the book about how sometimes we're still going to shout. And that really worked for
Uh-huh.
me, because I was like, no matter how hard I try, there are still moments when I shout. But I love the idea
Right.
that we can shout the fact that I'm feeling really frustrated right now. And that actually
Yeah.
makes me feel better. So I'm not
Right.
doing damage. I'm not hurting
Yeah.
my child. I'm not saying anything I shouldn't
Yeah.
say. I'm venting my frustration in the moment. And that
Mm-hmm.
in itself sometimes helps me become a bit more mindful, because I then kind of think, okay, you've let it out, calm down. How do I actually want to respond now, rather than, saying something that I'm really going to regret, or doing something,
Right.
some that I'm going to regret, so that really helps for me.
And when we name it, like what the research says is we name our emotions. You put people in MRI machines, you can actually see this happening. You watch the blood flow out of the amygdala, which is the big emotional part of the brain, and then you name that emotion. I'm angry, I'm sad, I'm frustrated. And you actually watch the blood flow into the prefrontal cortex, where we think things through and
Yeah.
manage our impulses. And it flows into our insular cortices, where we take perspective and understand where other people are coming from, when we have empathy and compassion. And so it's like literally naming it, like in ourselves or in someone else, has that effect of
Hmm.
actually starting to calm us down, and enough that our kind of prefrontal cortex comes back online, and hopefully we can then make a good choice, about how we
Yeah.
respond. And our kid can make a good choice too about
Yeah.
how they respond. Yeah, yeah,
Definitely. And then again, you're modeling it, aren't you? You're modeling the name it to
right,
tame it for your kids. So hopefully
right,
they're going to start to mimic that somewhere along the
yeah,
line as well,
yeah,
which is good.
exactly,
So
exactly.
what advice do you give to parents who want to cultivate self-compassion for themselves, but they're struggling then with their inner critic?
Yeah, I mean, to me, I think it's. I mean, I really feel like the most invitational question, which is not from me, it's from Chris Germer, Kristen Neff, I think, is like, how would I treat a friend? How would I treat a child? How would I treat someone who I care about on a good day, right? Sometimes
Hmm.
on a bad day, I'd treat a child not so great. I'd treat my friend and be like, what's the matter with you? Right. But on a good day, and really trying to get curious about that and come up with what are those words. If your friend was running late for pickup, would you say you're the worst parent in the world, get ready for a lifetime of therapy bills, they'll never right, what would
Yeah.
you say to them? And then trying to write down for yourself some of those mistakes and some of those things that you would say to a friend. And then it's just a little bit of practice trying to kind of, in some ways, rather than trying to tell the critical voice to shut up, to me, it's how do we turn up the volume a bit on the more compassionate voice inside. So
Hmm.
trying to get to the place where we can say to ourselves a little more readily, like, okay, like we all make mistakes. Get to that common humanity of, no parent is perfect. Everyone runs late sometimes. Everyone loses track of time. And then just kind of making a wish for ourselves, like, may I be kind to myself, and may I try to set the alarm earlier tomorrow, and that kind of thing. But I think it can help to almost like script out some of our phrases that we
Hmm.
wish that more compassionate inner voice would say, and practice
Hmm.
them, as corny as it sounds. I know so many parents are like, oh my gosh, that sounds so corny. But it really is, I think, powerful to practice that a
Absolutely.
little
I
bit.
vouch for that. My bedroom is covered the walls with things that I've wanted to learn to say or stop saying, or phrases to replace phrases. And it's the
Yeah.
only way. And my phone is full of reminders as well. Loads of Becky Kennedy ones that pop up at me to remind me of better scripts I could say in the moment. And sometimes that will have pinged on my phone 10 minutes ago. So when I'm presented with the moment, because they come along thick and fast, I'm like, brilliant. I just heard
Yeah.
that. So I agree with that. I think that is, yeah, it might be corny, or sometimes when people come around my house, they probably think I'm a little crazy, but it definitely is working for me.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, good. Good. Yeah.
So if there was one message about mindfulness or compassion that you wanted every parent to hear, what would it be as your final words for the podcast today?
Yeah, I mean, I think it doesn't have to be hard. It doesn't have to be time consuming. This is multiple messages, but it can be simple. It can be, pull into the driveway, on your way home and just take 3 breaths. That last stop. I don't know where you are. On the tube or on the bus or on the train. From the second to last stop to the last stop. Just like pause and notice the sounds, of the train or the bus around you, so that you come home, and at least then you're not bringing more chaos home.
Yeah.
You're bringing some calm in the door, and that's the most important thing that your kids need, is that kind of all breathing that same air um, of mindfulness, and that it really is contagious, and the research actually really shows that it's contagious too. So the more we can embody it ourselves, the more it'll trickle out to those around us. Yeah.
Lovely. Well, thank you, Chris. I feel like there's absolutely loads we can take away in that podcast about mindfulness and how it all links into resilience, how it plays out in our own inner critic, and how we can try and cultivate that in our children. I love that you touched on a growth mindset and how that plays in as well, because I find that absolutely fascinating. And you've given us some stories from your own life, which I know the listeners always really enjoy hearing. So thank you
Oh,
very much for
good.
your time today.
Thank you so much. It's been a real treat.